The 2025 trade deadline will go down in history as one of the craziest deadlines. From former Cy Young winners like Shane Bieber being traded, top 5 prospects in all of baseball like Leo DeVries being traded, multiple bullpen arms going for a huge price like Mason Miller, David Bednar, Camilo Doval. There were so many players being moved, and not to mention Carlos Correa heading back to the Houston Astros from the Minnesota Twins. With so many things happening, it's really interesting to see how the landscape of baseball has changed really in just a short 24 hours. Of course, there were trades happening before the 31st, but all of the activity that happened on this deadline was an absolute flurry and has really reshaped the structure of the league. However, there have been so many trades, you can't just look at one and decipher how exactly an organization did, with so many moving parts going across the league. In this video, we will look at every single player who was traded after July 20th and look exactly at what teams gained, what they lost, and give every single team in Major League Baseball an overall grade based on their ability to use the chips that they've got to go ahead and try and win a World Series, whether that's this year or in the future. Before we begin, it would mean a lot if you could subscribe to the channel. It's the easiest way to support me and also get great baseball content not only from this channel, but other really awesome baseball content creators out there as well. Without further ado, let's dive headfirst in alphabetical order each of the MLB's 30 teams and evaluate each of their trade deadlines. We'll start with one of the big sellers of the trade deadline, the Arizona Diamondbacks, who were expecting to be competitive this year, but got a little bit unlucky with their record and ended up trading away nearly all of their pieces away that were on expiring contracts. We'll start with the Merrill Kelly trade, where they received 3 prospect pitchers back in return from the Texas Rangers. This was a decent haul that Arizona got back for an expiring contract, including 2 of Texas's top 10 prospects in the organization, and all 3 were within the top 20, according to both Baseball America and MLB Pipeline. This is a really solid haul, and all 3 have starting pitcher upside. Eugenio Suarez has had a monster year, and the Diamondbacks got a very solid package back from him in his walk year as well, getting near top 100 prospect Tyler Locklear, who was ranked 9th according to MLB Pipeline in the system, and the Mariners had 8 in their system of top 100 prospects, so right on the border, and Hunter Cranton and Juan Burgos are both 2 solid pieces that they can develop. Burgos has already made his Major League debut, so he could definitely help Arizona out in 2026. Randall Grichuk for Andrew Hoffman is just a solid trade of getting rid of someone on a contract that is expiring at the end of the year for a flyer. Hoffman is a relief pitcher who I'm not expecting to do super great things, but could be a solid piece for the Diamondbacks. The other final big trade that they made was also with the Mariners, sending Josh Naylor their way, getting 2 more pitchers back. Brandon Garcia and Ashton Izzy are both interesting prospects, although Garcia is basically locked into a relief role. Izzy definitely is more likely to be a starter, but if he isn't able to make it, he's more than likely to be either a long reliever or out of the majors altogether, rather than settle into a relief role, because he doesn't really have a strong off-speed pitch. Finally, they traded away the contracts of Jordan Montgomery and Shelby Miller away to the Milwaukee Brewers in exchange for either a player to be named later or some cash considerations. An interesting trade, but not necessarily one that I expected or anyone really expected them to make. But getting money off the books is always fine. It's all just a matter of where exactly they're going to go from here. In total, the Diamondbacks had a solid deadline, but they have a lot of high floor, low ceiling kind of guys, which limits the ability for them to really rebuild and have a super strong team with a lot of their acquisitions, which is always difficult when you're trading away expiring contracts. That can be difficult to do on expiring contracts, but I'm still a little disappointed. For the Diamondbacks, they're going to get a B+. We'll head across the country to Atlanta when we look at a team that really was expected to have a couple more trades, but actually didn't do a ton. They grabbed Jim Jarvis, a shortstop prospect, in exchange from Rafael Montero. Nothing really moved the needle in that trade with the Rays, but they did acquire Tyler Kinley from the Colorado Rockies in a deal that should net them a reliever for multiple years to come. Kinley has a $5 million club option for 2026 that I expect them to exercise, so Kinley will be a part of their 2026 team where they do expect to compete. They also picked up Carlos Carrasco and Eric Fede from the Yankees and Cardinals respectively, as they really needed some help to bolster a rotation that has been ravaged by injuries. They also got a little bit of cash from Stuart Fairchild. This has been a very minor deadline for the Braves, nothing super interesting, and they had a lot of pieces on expiring contracts or that were somewhat expected to be moved, and so for that reason, I'm going to give this a grade of a C-. I think they could have done a lot more with the pieces they had available to trade. The Orioles did the opposite of the Braves and traded away almost every single player on an expiring deal. Charlie Morton brought back a low-level relief prospect who could potentially have some impact at the major league level, but Micah Ashman most likely won't be a high-impact or high-leverage arm at the major league level. The biggest trade by number of players traded was the Ramon Laureano and Ryan O'Hearn trade between the Orioles and San Diego, where the Orioles acquired all 6 players back in prospects that were taken by the Padres in the 2024 MLB draft. Boston Baseman is the best one. He's only 19, pitching in high A, and was their second round pick in that draft and has done okay so far in high A. But Right now they're looking to be buying low on some of these players. For instance, the third round pick of that draft, Cobb Hightower, is a middle infielder who has struggled so far in high a 677 OPS in 40 games at that level. So they're buying low on a lot of prospects who recently got drafted and they think they can adapt with. This is definitely a place where they actually got some decent value for the players they got, especially given their contract situations. And with a lot of flyers to go with it as well, this is a solid deal for the Orioles. They also traded Cedric Mullins to the Mets and got back three solid prospects, none of whom really jump out the page to me. But given that Mullins is having a down year and is in a contract year, these are three pieces that the Orioles think they could use as bottom of the 26-man roster kind of guys. Anthony Nunez might be a bench infielder. Chandler Marsh and Raimon Gomez could be potentially back-end bullpen pieces or late-inning starters, so definitely an interesting piece there. Sending Andrew Kittredge to the Cubs got an interesting return in Wilfred De La Cruz, who signed for $2.3 million back in January as part of the most recent international signing class. He's an interesting prospect, and we'll see how he develops. He's definitely a lot of time before he reaches the majors. Ramon Urias got traded to the Houston Astros as well for Twine Palmer, a low-level guy who has a chance to be a back-end bullpen kind of piece, but given that Urias was being pushed out in Baltimore, they didn't get a ton from him. Duran Watts-Brown is an interesting piece who could probably pitch in Baltimore in 2026 as a starter, a third-round draft pick in the 2023 draft by the Toronto Blue Jays. Although in-division trades aren't necessarily my favorite, I think sometimes you have to pull the trigger, and this was a deal I think worked out for both teams, and it'll work out even better for the Orioles if the Blue Jays don't end up winning the World Series. The return from Gregory Soto was fine, nothing necessarily to write home about, but for a player on an expiring contract and someone who's fallen a little bit out of favor in the Orioles bullpen, not a bad return at all. Although I don't necessarily think this is a great trade for the Orioles, it was fine, but I think based on how the reliever market ended up shaking out, wasn't as good as they would have thought. And then to replace some of the arms that they have traded away, they acquired Dietrich Enge for some cash considerations from the Detroit Tigers. Overall, I think the Orioles did pretty dang well in this trade deadline, and for that reason, I'm going to give them an A-. I think there were a couple misses, but that's inevitable when you do so many trades like they just did. Red Sox fans have been frustrated with the front office after this deadline has finished, and I think rightfully so. They acquired Dustin May, who is a starter but has been used in relief nearly the entire season by the Dodgers, in exchange for Zach Everhard and James Tibbs III. Tibbs, who they just acquired in the deal that sent Rafael Devers to San Francisco. I think Tibbs by itself is a better player than Dustin May. He was a first-round pick in last year's draft, and adding another prospect on top of that is just salt in the wound. May is leaving at the end of this year, most likely, as he is on the last year of his initial period before hitting free agency, and he's been injured a ton. Don't know if I really love this deal. I also don't think Steven Matz moved the needle, especially with the amount of players that have been moved around, especially in the American League. You look at what the Tigers have done in terms of their acquisitions or what the Yankees have done. They're really securing up their bullpen, and the Red Sox did not do a ton of that. Blaze Jordan isn't going to be a world breaker, most likely, so I don't think the Red Sox are going to be super hurt by this deal, but I still don't love it. For their efforts this trade deadline, I'm giving them a D-, one of the worst, because I really think this was an absolute fumble and they lost both of their trades. And when you're fighting for a playoff spot as a wildcard team and currently in position to win a wildcard spot, I would have expected you to go a little bit more all in. Unlike the Red Sox, I think the Cubs made the most of the few trades they did make. Taylor Rogers originally got traded to the Pirates from the Reds in the Brian Hayes deal, but the Cubs scooped him up, so this is now his third NL Central team in the span of about 5 days. And giving up Ivan Brethrow is fine. He's not a super highly touted prospect, and I think he fits well into a Cubs bullpen that could use another lefty arm. Andrew Kittredge also got added, giving up Wilfred De La Cruz, who was the person who signed for the 9th highest bonus in the 2025 international signing class. Hurts a lot. It's not my favorite trade, but I think it's reasonable enough given that he's still far out and you're looking to win right now. And the addition of Michael Soroka, I think, is a little bit too late. They had a lot of starting pitching injuries earlier in the season, even just a couple weeks ago. I think adding him then would have made a lot of sense, but again, when the stove is hot, things just end up happening. He's not a bad addition, but I do wonder if he's actually going to start come the playoffs. Willie Castro, I think, is a great addition as a utility piece. He plays a lot of second base, but he can play almost anywhere on the infield. And I don't think the Cubs are going to be super hurt with the loss of Ryan Gallagher or Sam Armstrong, but the Twins will be happy with those additions. For the Cubs' efforts, I'm going to give them a solid B. I think it's a totally fine deadline. They could have gone a little bit harder in, especially given how much other contenders upgraded. But I think some of their main competition, like the Brewers, didn't upgrade that much, so I'm not hurting that much when I'm looking at their trade deadline. The White Sox also had a relatively quiet deadline, only conducting 2 trades. The first for Adrian Houser, and I think anything they could have gotten back from this would have been a win, given that they picked him up off waivers from the Texas Rangers back in May, and getting former top 100 prospect Curtis Mead I think is a huge win. Mead has the potential to be a very solid player going forward, and he has ample opportunity in the White Sox organization when he was kind of limited to that with the Rays, as they had a lot of infield players that they were trying to get reps in at the position. Finally, trading away Austin Slater, I think, was just a win in itself. I don't think he was really a world breaker in any way, and Gage Steele does add to their roster in some way. However, I think there are still some pieces the White Sox could have traded away, and probably should have, in my opinion. Although they weren't necessary to trade away, and maybe there wasn't a market for it, I still think it would have been nice if they could have, and I'm going to give them the same grade I gave the Chicago Cubs, a solid B. Cincinnati made one of the first trades of the trade deadline, acquiring Correa and Hayes from their interdivision rivals for Taylor Rogers and Sammy Stafura, which I thought at the time made a lot of sense. Even if Hayes isn't a big offensive threat, he does provide a stellar defense at the hot corner. Miguel Andujar is a okay piece. He's not going to be a special piece for the Reds. I don't think they really do anything special with Andujar. I don't think that boosts them up in any way. Kenny Huggins is an interesting prospect, mostly because he was drafted out of the same junior college in the same year as their first round pick and one of their top prospects in Cam Collier, was just an interesting little tidbit. Zach Littell is another solid addition. The one issue with him is he gives up a lot of home runs, and Cincinnati is known to give up a lot of home runs just because of their ballpark dimensions. So trading him away in that 3-team deal, including the Rays and the Dodgers, is just not something I love. And I think Adam Serwanowski is someone who does have some value. I also don't think the Reds were necessarily in a position to buy right now. They've been in a weird spot where they should be contending, but haven't been the past couple seasons. So I don't hate that they're going all in, but I do wonder if that was the right move. Although I'm content with these moves, I think that fact brings their grade down for a little bit, and I think the Reds got a B- for their dealings this time. If they're going to go all in, it's fine, but I think I would have preferred if they sold. The Cleveland Guardians had a very interesting deadline. There was lots of rumors about Steven Kwan and Emmanuel Clase before he ended up getting suspended, and Cade Smith, and none of them got traded. The trade pieces were Shane Bieber, the former Cy Young Award winner, and Paul Sewald. Sewald was a free agent at the end of the season, and the Guardians were not going ahead and contending, so I don't hate it, even if it's just for a player to be named later or cash. Sometimes those players turn out. Cal Steven is a solid prospect. I think Shane Bieber, in my opinion, would have commanded a little more, even if he's not at Cy Young form anymore. So I think I'm a little disappointed in that, but I am happy that they did keep their core together. I think that was a big takeaway from this deadline with all these rumors swirling. I think keeping people like Cade Smith and Steven Kwan was absolutely the right decision for the Guardians. And even though they didn't go and make a ton of trades, I still think they did enough with what they had. But because they didn't have a ton of value coming back, I'm going to have to give this a B+. And I think if they made a couple more trades or got some more people in, this had the potential to go higher. I just don't want to penalize a team for not being too aggressive, even though the market suggested that you should be aggressive, especially with relievers. But they did what they thought was right, and I'm going to reward them for sticking for that instead of going out being aggressive and potentially making a couple bad deals. The Rockies are always an interesting team to evaluate because they tend to target pitching in their trades because free agent pitchers don't end up actually wanting to sign in Colorado because it's such a hitter's park. But I don't know if I love exactly what they did at this deadline. Griffin Herring immediately becomes a top 5 prospect in their system. Not one of the best because I think that belongs to Charlie Condon and Cole Carrig, but definitely top 5, maybe number 6 if you're liking someone else a little bit more. And that's definitely a solid get for Ryan McMahon. And Josh Groves is a nice little throw-in piece as well. But I still just don't love the return. I think the Yankees had a lot of really interesting pieces, and Herring is definitely a very interesting piece, and I'm glad the Rockies got him. But I do wonder if there could have been a little bit more added in. This deadline, position players didn't go for as much as I think a lot of people thought in the media, so you have to take that into account. We already talked a little bit about the Tyler Kinley trade. I don't really love it, what they got back in Austin Smith. It's not anyone who's going to be a super impact player, which makes sense, but Kinley does have that extra year of control, which I think is part of the reason why I'm a little bit critical of that. I would have expected someone who at least would have been a little bit more well-known and a little bit more highly regarded. I do think their best trade, though, is trading Jake Berg for Rock Riggio and Ben Shields. I'm a big fan of Riggio, probably more than the average person, which is a little bit biased. Jake Berg, with 3 years of team control left, definitely hurt to get traded away, but I think they got 2 solid pieces and 2 players from the Yankees who are very, very good. Shields long-term could be a very nice lefty pitcher, and Riggio could be the second baseman of the future for the Rockies. I don't think the Rockies had as bad of a deadline as people have been saying, but that doesn't mean they've had a good deadline. I'm going to give them a grade of a C-. The Tigers weren't in on a lot of the splashy moves this deadline outside of Kyle Finnegan, but they did make some interesting trades. Matt Manning ended up being designated for assignment as a former top prospect and is now headed to Philadelphia. If they're going to DFA him, getting something back is definitely valuable. Charlie Morton is an interesting piece. I don't love that they're now moving Troy Belton into the bullpen for Charlie Morton, but I think now the Tigers have a ton of pitching depth to sustain themselves should a starter or two get hurt again ahead of the playoff push. I think Micah Ashman is a fair price to pay for that. Another bullpen piece in Cody Heuer, especially for cash, is not a big impact. I really like the addition of Kyle Finnegan for Josh Randall and RJ Sales. They're both solid pitchers, but I don't think they have as high of an upside as Finnegan for half the year, so I think this is a solid trade for the Tigers. Sewald used to be a dominant closer in Seattle, has had some struggles in Arizona and in Cleveland this year, so I think this is a solid pickup if he can get back to old form. Rafael Montero, similar situation, up and down. I think Jim Jarvis is a fair price to pay. Chris Paddock is in a similar boat to Charlie Morton. I personally have really liked Chris Paddock, another former top prospect. Enrique Jimenez is someone who is another good prospect now, but if he ends up at a similar path as Paddock as someone who just hasn't lived up the hype, that's totally fine. Jimenez also isn't a top prospect, so they didn't give up a ton for Paddock, but him plus Randy Dobnak I think is a fair addition. And the Tigers really are trying to make small adjustments because they're very happy with their current roster. I really like that's what they did. Getting rid of Dietrich Gens and bringing in Brewer Hicklin are all fine trades, and the Tigers not going all in is completely fine, but I do like how they really tried to tune their roster up a little bit based on what they thought their own needs were. I think they got a lot of really good relief pitchers on cheaper deals comparatively to what a lot of the other relievers have gone for, and for that reason, I'm going to give the Tigers a B+. The, as I like to call them, homeless Athletics made a couple of moves and really showed John Fisher isn't going to change if the team does end up moving to Las Vegas. We'll start with a smaller deal that we've already talked about a little bit. I think Kenya Huggins is an interesting prospect, and getting rid of Miguel Andujar for someone who has at least a little bit of upside and is still pretty young is definitely a win in my book. It's not a huge trade, and Huggins might be nothing more than a fifth starter, but still a solid addition. Of course, the biggest trade, maybe of the entire deadline, was Mason Miller and JP Sears going to San Diego in exchange for Leo DeVries and a couple more prospects. DeVries, in my opinion, is going to be a superstar. I think this is a huge get for the A's. And Mason Miller, I think part of the reason why he commanded so much is because the Padres think he can go ahead and be a starter. So the fact the A's were able to capitalize on that is a really big get. I really like this deal for them, especially because DeVries is such a big asset. This trade deadline was a win for the Athletics, but it also solidified that the same habits John Fisher had in Oakland and now in Sacramento are going to likely continue in Las Vegas, and that's something that the people in Las Vegas and those who have stuck around as the A's have continued their ways should be wary of. Although I do think the A's fan base has lost again, long term, if Leo DeVries can reach his ceiling, he's going to be electric, and for that reason, I'm giving the A's a grade of an A, because I can't grade on what John Fisher's doing, but rather the team as a whole in terms of their additions. The Astros had one of the most intriguing deadlines of maybe all time. Reacquiring Carlos Correa to play third base is certainly a decision. I'm sure the Houston faithful are going to be happy to have him, but Correa has been injured a ton, but they gave up almost nothing to get him. Matt Maluski is, not to be disrespectful, a bad pitcher. He's very old in high A. We're talking 26, and he has a really, really high ERA. He's going to be a non-factor. This was purely a salary dump by the Twins to get rid of a player who was on a 6-year, $200 million contract and has been injured a ton. This now coincides with Ramon Urias, who is a third baseman, a Gold Glove winning third baseman, who they traded away, and they got for a small price of Twine Palmer, but really doesn't fit long-term into their plans and was a trade I questioned pretty heavily. Jesus Sanchez is a much better addition. Shea Jaworski is the star player of this deal, but don't sleep on Ryan Gusto. He's pitched a little bit in the major leagues and has shown flashes of being a very good pitcher. Do I think the Marlins will be the ones to unlock that out of him? Not necessarily, but that potential is always there. For the Houston Astros, I'm not a huge fan of what they did this deadline, but it's definitely solid enough. I'm going to give them a grade of a C+. A lot of people had their eyes on what the Royals were going to do, mostly because two starting pitchers in Chris Bubik and Seth Lugo were both potentially available. Neither of them ended up getting traded, which I think long term was probably the right decision, and Lugo even got extended, as the Royals looked to go ahead and actually try and contend in 2026. Mike Yastrzemski is an interesting piece, and I don't think they lost too much in Junior Marte, who has the potential to be solid as a back-end starter, but to get another help in the outfield is definitely not a bad thing, especially because I think that's where their weakest spot is right now on their current roster. Looking at some of their other trades, I really like the addition of Bailey Falter for two solid players. Evan Sisk and Kalen Moss are not going to be huge impact players for the Royals, and Falter has been surprisingly good with the Pirates after being acquired from the Phillies. Randall Grichuk is one that I'm not super sure exactly fits long term. I don't love the trade acquisition from the Royals, but it's completely fine. There's a mutual option for 2026 for $5 million that I somewhat expect both teams to want to pick up, which is impressive given that he's only being paid around $2 million this year. So Grichuk has definitely paid in big time in terms of his acquisition. Finally, they've also acquired Julio E. Rodriguez, a minor league catcher from the Seattle Mariners, so not the center fielder, for cash considerations, just another smaller trade. Their deadline went about average, which is better than a lot of other teams can say, and for that reason, I'm going to give them a B. I think that for me is average. Some people might argue that should be a B-, but I think a B is fair for what they ended up doing. There are three things you can always count on: death, taxes, and the fact that the Angels will make questionable decisions at the MLB trade deadline, and that's exactly what they did. The acquisition of Oswald Parada is interesting. He is a former top prospect, and given that he's out of options, it makes sense the Yankees wanted to move on from him. I don't hate the flyer, but it also just doesn't make a ton of sense to me. Luis Rengifo is playing second base every day, and Zach Neto is certainly not moving off a shortstop. And with Mike Trout DHing every day, where do you plan on playing him? I really don't know. Maybe third, but you didn't trade away Yoan Moncada, and it's clear that you kind of did this as an all-in move. So I have no idea where you think you're going to play when you have players who are playing nearly every day. Of course, Moncada is a person who is going to have platoon splits, and so therefore he's really only against righties. So Peraza will come in on those days. But realistically, how many lefties are there actually? There's not that many. You're probably expecting two, maybe three in a rotation. So you're getting someone who's playing 50% of the games at best. Not a bad flyer, but just doesn't make a ton of sense to me. They did end up going in with their acquisition of two relievers in Andrew Chafin and Luis Garcia from the Washington Nationals, however. Jake Eder was a former top prospect. He's been traded around a lot, originally drafted from the Marlins in the 2020 draft, then went to the White Sox in the Jake Burger trade, then ended up in an Angels uniform when he got traded for cash at the beginning of the season, and now to the Washington Nationals. So a nice flyer. Again, they like their highly rated guys, and Sam Brown is just kind of a throw-in. It's fine. It's cheaper than a lot of the other relievers who got acquired, but they also didn't get the high-end guys, so who knows exactly how this is going to work out for the Angels. This is just clearly, as it has been nearly every year. 2023, I gave them an excuse because it was your last year of Shohei Ohtani. You go all in or you trade him, one of the two. I wouldn't blame them either way. But to me, this is just a straight F. I never understand what they're actually trying to do with the trade deadline. At some point, you cut your losses and understand that a bird in the hand is not necessarily worth two in the bush when you're talking about baseball. Sometimes getting some prospects for 2027, 2028, whatever it is better than fielding a team now in 2025 that's going to miss the playoffs. Dodgers had a really interesting deadline. I love the acquisition of James Tibbs III and Zach Kerhad for Dustin May. I think that's a big win. Tibbs is a borderline top 100 prospect. I have no idea what the Red Sox were doing trading him away. Kyle Harrison was a big get in the trade that sent Rafael Devers from Boston to San Francisco, but Tibbs was right up with them. Not at the same pedigree. Harrison could be a top 25, 50 prospect at times, but Tibbs was definitely a very nice addition. And to trade him away for a guy who is going to start most likely in Boston, but has tons of injury concerns. It's on an expiring deal. I just don't understand that at all. I think the Dodgers made out really well in this deal. I think going from James Outman to Alex Call is a little bit of a downgrade, even if James Outman hasn't been great since his basically rookie year. Talking about two trades at once here, Alex Call getting traded for Sean Lennon is a little bit tough. I think Lennon, who's had a breakout year in the Dodgers organization in the minor leagues so far, plus Eric Swan is a little bit of a steep price to pay for someone who is now over 30 and isn't that great to begin with from the Washington Nationals. And the James Outman for Brock Stewart trade is super interesting. That trade took a long time to actually get finalized because of Brock Stewart's extensive injury history. And Outman is a former top 100 prospect and someone who there's a lot of hype around. I don't necessarily love the trade, but it's interesting enough. I also think the Dodgers did really well in the three-team Zach Littell trade. Hunter Fiducia is 28 and still technically a prospect, and I think they got by far the better part of this deal, as Adam Serenowski is, I think, the best prospect in this deal. They also got Paul Jervis, who is a solid player who just made his major debut recently and has the potential to be a decent reliever for the Dodgers, especially with how they can lock things out of pitchers, and Ben Rortvedt as another addition as catching depth. Hunter Fiducia, I think that is a more than fair swap. I think the Dodgers made out very well in that deal. Overall, there's something that I really like about this, like the James Tibb deal and what they got in Adam Sermanowski. And other parts, like the Alex Call deal and trading away James Outman that I don't necessarily love, even if Outman has lost a lot of his shine. Overall, this is a very solid trade deadline haul, and I'm going to give them an A-. I very much expected the Marlins to be a little more active. I think that's because there were Edward Cabrera and Sandy Alcantara rumors swirling around, and a lot with their position players as well, like Xavier Edwards and Otto Lopez, but they only struck two deals, the aforementioned Jesus Sanchez deal. I like it. I don't love it for the Marlins. I think Jay Shaworski is an interesting pickup. Even if they do have a lot of solid players in the middle infield right now, I think that's a good addition. And Ryan Gusto, although I don't have faith in the Marlins to actually develop anyone, being a starter they can plug into the rotation now, or even be a nice back-end bullpen piece, a nice swingman guy is definitely a solid addition, because I think personally he has number 4, number 5 starter upside, even if the industry consensus doesn't necessarily say that. However, where I think things fall a little bit short, they traded away catcher Nick Fortes, who has fallen out of favor in Miami, for Matthew Etzel. And I don't think Etzel is as good as a prospect as he's currently rated on a lot of sites. I just don't think he has the potential to be anything more than a corner fourth outfielder, which Fortes has been, again, out of style for a little bit. He's lost a lot of playing time to Agustin Ramirez, and Joe Mack is knocking very hard on the door in AAA. So there was space to trade him away, but I just don't love what they got out of Nick Fortes, and I definitely think they could have done a little bit better in terms of actually going and trading away some other pieces that would have brought back value, as the Marlins are not contending right now. And I think they could have done a little bit more to actually get some players for the future when they should be contending. For that reason, the Miami Marlins and Peter Bendix are going to get a C- for their trade grade this deadline. The Brewers definitely had a very quiet deadline, only making 2 trades. One of the more interesting ones of the entire deadline was them acquiring Nestor Cortez, who started basically his entire career. But in this instance, because the Brewers' biggest strength is their rotation, they could probably go 6, 7 deep in a playoff series if they really needed to, of just starter after starter after starter. That Cortez is probably going to come out of the bullpen. And trading away Brandon Lockridge, I think, is a good trade to get, just see how that's going to work out and see if he can adapt to a relief role. Adding in Jorge Quintana and cash considerations is just a cherry on top. I also like their addition of Danny Jansen. Right now, William Contreras does have a hand injury that he's been nursing basically the entire season. So Jansen gives them an option to now go behind the dish and get Contreras more DH days so he can spend more time healing his hand and be ready for the playoffs. But though I really do like Jader Arenamo, I think he has the potential to be a very good shortstop going forward. He's nothing better than a bottom of the lineup good defensive shortstop. And although the Brewers do have a ton of corner infield depth, and probably I would have preferred for them to trade away from that, I don't hate this trade, even though I do think the price is a little steep for Jansen. With that being said, the Brewers didn't do a bad job. I think it's solid. I think being a little passive is going to hurt them in the long run, given just how much volume and talent a lot of other teams have added, especially in the American League, which makes it a little easier to stomach. But overall, I think I'm going to give the Brewers an A minus. The Twins deadline is super interesting, and it's characterized by the fact that the Twins are $44 million in debt, which is the entire reason why they decided to trade Carlos Correa away for basically nothing, for a pitcher who, frankly, might not even be pitching in a year and will probably make his major league debut never. Of course, rooting for the guy, don't want anything bad to happen to him, don't know him personally, don't know if he's done anything wrong, but I have no reason to believe that he will ever be a major league starter. This was purely a salary dump. They did make a couple interesting trades, though. Taj Bradley for Griffin Jackson is one that sticks out to me. Bradley is a former top prospect, top 50 prospect in all of baseball. He's been injured a little bit, and he's currently pitching in AAA after having some struggles with the Rays. I think he immediately slots into the starting rotation for the Minnesota Twins and has the potential to be a really, really good pitcher in the long term. Jackson's a reliever, obviously very good, a couple years of team control there, but I think Bradley is a better player long term, especially given the value starter versus reliever that you can get. The addition of Alan Roden, I think, is also solid. I don't think there was any reason the Twins needed to keep Louis Varland and Ty France, and Alan Roden, I think, by himself is a good addition for both those players, and getting Kendry Rojas on top of that is just the cherry on top. Brian Gallagher and Sam Armstrong are solid, but I don't know if I love them as a return for Willie Castro. Gallagher was a 6th-round pick in the 2024 draft, and at 22, he's done really well at AA, which is really impressive, especially because he came from a smaller school and has recovered from Tommy John in 2023. I'm interested to see exactly how he's going to end up. I think there is potential for him to be a solid number 4 or number 5 starter, but beyond that, I do wonder if they could have gotten a little bit more. But at the end of the day, this is still a pretty solid return for a position player when the position player acquisition this deadline has been relatively weak in terms of the prospects teams have gotten back. I've already mentioned the Correa trade, and Garrett Horn for Daily Coulomb is fine. Coulomb wasn't going to really get a ton of value from anyone anyway, so getting someone is still a plus. I like the upside James Outman has, and I think he will be the center fielder of the future because I think after what the Twins did this deadline, I have a hard time believing Byron Buxton will not ask to be traded this offseason. I have no issue with them taking a flyer there for Brock Stewart. Trading away Harrison Bader is also a nice addition, I think, by getting Henry Mendez, who a lot of people think is underrated. I personally don't. I don't see him as anything more than a 4th outfielder long term, but some people have really said that they really like his hit tool and can see him growing and developing into a very solid player. And Jeremy Valoria is a nice player who's currently very low in the minor leagues and the Dominican Summer League, who can go ahead and be an impact player potentially in 4 or 5 years. Of course, their biggest trade was acquiring Eduardo Tate and Micah Bell for Jhoan Duran. This is a big, big addition, a huge, huge boon to their minor league system, as Bell will probably be able to start right away at the major league level if they wanted to, especially based on the amount of talent they just traded away. And Eduardo Tate is one of my personal favorite prospects. I think he has the potential to be an all-star catcher at the next level. Not that Micah Bell doesn't have the potential to be an all-star pitcher, because he definitely does, but I'm definitely very high on Eduardo Tate. They also acquired another catcher in Enrique Jimenez, which gives them a little bit of protection if one of them doesn't end up being a catcher long term, although I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be. Trading away for Chris Paddock and Randy Dobnak, I think that's a solid deal. It's really difficult to grade what the Twins have done just because there's so many moving parts, so many good players and prospects being moved. Really difficult to actually give them a concrete grade. If I'm a Twins fan, I'm probably also giving this an S, just like I gave the A's an F, because this sucks to be a Twins fan. But I think the future is somewhat bright still, and overall, it's not a bad deadline, so I'm going to give them a B+. Getting 2 top 100 prospects is a huge win no matter what, in my opinion. The Mets had another interesting deadline, and I think although the relief pitching is definitely a place to talk about, I think talking about center fielder Cedric Mullins is the best place to start because the Mets knew they needed to shore up their center field. And in a down year and in a contract year, I think they did a really good job of leveraging the fact that the Orioles were looking for more quantity than quality, trade away some decent prospects, but none of them have huge upside in exchange for the last year of Mullins' services. Then, of course, we go to the bullpen, and I think Ryan Helsley is a solid addition. Jesus Baez does hurt to lose, especially given that Helsley is on an expiring contract, but I think it's a fine trade. I think the Cardinals made out pretty well, but if you're going to go all in, I don't necessarily hate this for the Mets, but it is a lot to give up. The same goes for Tyler Rogers, which I'm a little bit more critical of. Jose Butto, I think, is a solid player who now the Giants are able to use in a even better spot as there is a bit of a pitcher's park effect in San Francisco. I'm personally really high on Drew Gilbert. He's currently playing in AAA, should make an impact at the major league level soon, and Blade Tidwell has already made his debut and is a decently highly rated prospect. I also don't hate this deal, but I do think it's worse than the Ryan Helsley deal and the Gregory Soto deal, which I'm personally fine with. I think Soto is a solid player, and with the additions the Mets have made, he doesn't have to be a super high leverage guy, just another lefty out of the bullpen, which I think they desperately needed. So I think Soto is a solid pickup, and they didn't give up that much for it. I think this might be the best deal of all three of the relievers that the Mets acquired. It's hard to balance that the Mets definitely needed to do these moves in order to be successful, but also I don't necessarily love the value that they ended up trading away. Given that the reliever market was kind of tough, I think I have to take that in consideration. Overall, the Mets did what they needed to do, and that's really all you can ask for. Although I do think they did overpay a little bit for some of the players and could have allocated those resources elsewhere to get another upgrade at some of these positions. I don't think Rogers and Soto were necessarily the best players on the market. I don't think it would have taken much more to have gotten better relievers on this trade market, so for that reason, I'm going to have to give them an A-. As we shift over from Queens to Bronx, the Yankees were even more active than a lot of teams this deadline. Camilo Doval was a last-second deadline splash, and I think they made out very well. Doval hasn't matched his 2023 form, but I don't think they gave up a ton of prospects in order to get there, at least prospects that really would potentially make a big impact at the major league level. I'm not the biggest fan of Jesus Rodriguez. I think he's solid. And Tristan Vreeling is someone I personally have had a little bit of a prospect crush on since he got drafted in 2022. But I also recognize that his upside is not sky high. He's probably nothing more than a 4 or 5 starter. And Carlos De La Rosa being so far away and Parks Harbor being relatively old, I think are very good trades. And I really like the fact that they acquired Camilo Doval. And the Giants, not so much in the side of the deal. Acquiring Jose Caballero from the Rays is definitely something I did not expect them to do, but it gives them another possibility to platoon if they really wanted to. Don't think this was necessarily needed, but you can say that about a lot of the trades that were made. Everson Pereira is an interesting player to trade away. I don't know that I love that they traded him away, but that plus a player not to be named later is not necessarily a make or break deal that the Yankees did. If Caballero can be a good addition, then more power to them. On top of Doval, they've also acquired 2 very solid relievers in Jake Bird from the Colorado Rockies and David Bednar from the Pirates. Both of them required some capital to be invested in prospects, but I think a little bit less than what I would have expected given the reliever market this deadline. Rock Riccio is someone I am very fond of. I think he could be a very solid second baseman, especially now that he's in Coors. And Ben Shields also solid, but I think that's a fair return for multiple years of Jake Bird. And with David Bednar, they traded away 2 catchers, which I think they didn't really need given that Austin Wells is the catcher of the future in New York. And I don't see Brian Sanchez as anything more than a probable 4th outfielder or platoon bat, so I think this is definitely a solid addition. Of course, they also traded again with the Colorado Rockies earlier in the trade deadline where they acquired Brian McMahon for Griffin Herring and Josh Groves. The Yankees trust their pitching development. Losing Herring is tough. He's a top prospect in their organization. They also acquired Ahmed Rosario, which makes the Jose Caballero trade a little bit more questionable, in my opinion, again, for Clayton Beeter, who was a solid player who the Yankees just moved to their bullpen. I think has a lot of potential still, and Brown Martinez. This is a fine trade and helps them out this year. No complaints about that. I really like what the Yankees did, and even though I think they did pay a little bit much for Ryan McMahon, I don't hate it that much, and for that reason, they're going to be one of 2 A+ in this video. The Phillies also had a very interesting deadline, highlighted by the Jhoan Duran trade. I don't love that they traded away 2 top 100 prospects for him, but given that he does have multiple years of control and seeing how the other trades have panned out for other relief pitchers, I don't hate it that much. I think I've grown on it a little bit since the trade was first announced because we've gotten more trades. So that trade broke on the 30th while the deadline was on the 31st. I also really like the addition of Harrison Bader. I think it makes it a lot easier for you to feel comfortable DHing someone like Kyle Schwarber every day. And Matt Manning's an interesting flyer that, if it doesn't work out, Joseph Quinones is a fine lottery ticket to send back to Detroit. And if you do end up unlocking something out of Matt Manning, I think that's a big plus. And then acquiring Brewer Hicklin is kind of just whatever, in my opinion. You still got two options, so definitely not a bad thing. Another piece of outfield depth is definitely not a bad thing. Cal Stevenson, Brewer Hicklin now as minor league outfielders who are already on the 40-man roster. There's some potential for things to be good. Don't hate it, but it doesn't move me one way or the other. I wouldn't be shocked to see him DFA'd at some point either because he's already 29. Overall, a solid deadline for the Phillies. That could backfire if Micabel or Eduardo Tate really grow out to be superstars, which the potential is very high, but I think this is a good trade deadline for them and definitely sets them up to potentially win a World Series, giving them an overall grade of an A-. We're going to have an opposite opinion about their in-state rivals, the Pittsburgh Pirates. I don't really love what they got back in the David Bednar trade. I think catcher is one of the positions that they actually didn't need to worry about long-term. They don't necessarily have an answer there, but I don't think Rafael Flores or Edglin Perez really offer any better of an answer than what they currently have. Evan Sisk and Callan Moss definitely don't move the needle for me for Bailey Falter, who I thought would have a little bit more value than that. I think he's been a very good pitcher this year, and the Pirates have done a great job of unlocking things out of their starting pitchers, Falter being one of them. Looking at the Ke'Bryan Hayes return, they did acquire Taylor Rogers, who they immediately flipped for Ivan Brethrow, which is completely fine by me. I don't love the Ke'Bryan Hayes move. I think that it was kind of short-sighted because Hayes is on a very cheap contract extension that he signed and could have been the third baseman for the future, and I don't think the Pirates had a ton of third base options really ready in the minor leagues to take over. That's just my own personal opinion. And Stafura has an okay hit tool, but he probably could stick at shortstop, so I don't hate it, but I really don't think it's a great deal. I do dislike it, though, which can be said about basically every trade they've made. I do think Jeter Martinez for Caleb Ferguson is probably their best trade. Martinez is a solid pitcher and has the potential to be a good, solid foundation piece for the Pirates going forward. Again, their prospect list is full of pitchers because the Pirates actually do a really good job of developing pitchers outside of Paul Skeens, who didn't really need any development, really. But I do think this is one of the worst trade deadlines that teams have had this year, and I'm going to unfortunately have to give them a D overall for this. The Padres also had one of the most interesting deadlines to look at as they traded away their top prospect in Leo DeVries and again a top 5 prospect in all of Major League Baseball for Mason Miller and JP Sears. I think it's very evident that they wouldn't have done this unless they believed Mason Miller can start, which he did do back in 2023 before the A's moved him full-time to the bullpen. There's a chance he can. I'm not saying it's out of the picture. He would be much more valuable as a starter than as a closer, but that's still there. And JP Sears is a solid, controllable piece. Trading away Brandon Nett and Henry Baez do hurt a little bit. Nett especially is also a very highly touted prospect. The Padres farm system is relatively weak, so number 5 I believe he was before he was traded. Does not translate necessarily to a super highly rated prospect in other systems, but he's still a solid addition. The Freddie Fermin trade isn't a huge get in my opinion. I don't think Fermin is a big upgrade at catcher. Trading away Burgett and Kolek is also fine. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't have done it, but it's just not really calling out to me in a significant way. Will Wagner is another piece that kind of whatever. It's another smaller addition, doesn't really make a big dent. What really makes a big dent is Ryan O'Hearn and Ramon Laureano deals, where they traded away 6 players from their 2024 draft class. That is a crazy big number of prospects. Trading away 6 prospects is just such an AJ Preller thing to do in the first place. Boston Bateman's probably the best one of the bunch. He's personally one of my favorite prospects, a high schooler, only 19 years old, a really big lefty on the mound, a lot of potential there. And Caleb Hightower, the 3rd round pick in that draft, has struggled a little bit at high A, so if he can bounce back, there'll be a lot of potential there. Acquiring Brandon Lockridge as well is fine for Nestor Cortez and Jorge Quintana. I don't think it's anything super notable, but completely fine. Nothing necessarily to write home about. The one thing I always know about the Padres is they're going to do something interesting. Doesn't mean it's going to be crazy and wrong, but they're going to do something interesting. I think this deadline, they did some interesting things that are somewhat questionable. I don't hate them, but given that the Padres have a relatively weak farm system, I think they did what they could with what they had. And although I don't love that they traded away a top prospect, I think getting Miller and Sears back for him, they could have done a lot worse, most likely. So for that reason, I'm just going to give them a straight B+. The Giants deadline can be characterized as a tale of 2 deadlines. I think the Doval trade was somewhat questionable. I think it was a good decision to trade him. He hadn't reached his 2023 form, which definitely lowered the value he was going to get back in the first place. But relievers are going for a ton. I just don't think they actually got a ton for him. Jesus Rodriguez and Tristan Vreeling are the 2 pieces that have the most significance coming back, and Carlos De La Rosa is a young, projectable arm. But nothing really excites me. There's nothing that's overwhelming about any of these prospects. And Parks Harbor is more of a high floor, low ceiling kind of guy. I just don't think they're going to get as much value as I really think they are from any of these players. Obviously, I'm not rooting against any of them, but I just don't think it was a great deal. On the other hand, I think getting what they got for Tyler Rogers is a huge win. I'm a big Drew Gilbert fan. I think Jose Butto is a very interesting addition who can be a starter for the Giants right now and help them potentially contend in 2026. I think that's a lot of what this trade was people who can go ahead, even make their major league debut this year, but really help the Giants push towards a title in next year and beyond. I think all three of these players, and Drew Gilbert, Blade Tidwell, and Jose Butto, can do that. Trading away Mike Yastrzemski is completely fine as well. Opens up an outfield slot for someone like a Drew Gilbert or whoever they want to acquire. So no issues there, and I think acquiring Junior Marte for him is a completely acceptable decision. For that reason, I'm going to give the Giants a C+ because I think they made one really good trade and one really bad trade and one trade, which kind of to me averages out to eh. Up in the Pacific Northwest, I think the Mariners had a very solid trade deadline. Although they ended up giving up more than what they originally acquired when they traded away Eugenio Suarez to the Arizona Diamondbacks in 2023, I think this was the right move for them to make no matter what. Third base was a glaring weakness, and Tyler Locklear was someone that the team definitely thought had potential, but there seemed to be a lot of doubt from Mariners fans about his abilities. Hunter Cranton and Juan Burgos are also good additional pieces, but I don't necessarily think they're make or break players. Same thing with Josh Naylor. Trading away Brandon Garcia and Ashton Izzy are fine. I think both had potential and probably both will be solid players at the major league level, but neither are world beaters. And if you want to win a World Series or even a playoff series for that matter for the Mariners, you needed to acquire Eugenio Suarez and Josh Naylor for your corner infield spots and go all in. And that's exactly what they did. No fan should be overly worked up about Julio E. Rodriguez being traded away for cash considerations. He's a minor league depth piece, so maybe he makes his debut with Kansas City at some point, but it's not something that I would be super impressed about if I was a Mariners fan. And then, of course, the Caleb Ferguson trade, they needed another bullpen arm. I think the Mariners could have benefited from adding another bullpen arm. And I do think Junior Martinez was a little rich, but I'm also recognizing that there have been some steep prices in the reliever market. Don't necessarily hate that they didn't add another arm, but I do think it would have helped them in their playoff push. And because of that, I'm going to bump them down to an A. I think this is a very good deadline, but I think making one more move to really solidify that bullpen would make gone a long way. It really cemented them as, in my opinion, the favorites to claim that third wildcard spot and make some noise in October. The Cardinals have sold for 2 times in the past 3 years, which is something they never did 20 years ago. They traded away relief pitcher Phil Maton in a deal to the Texas Rangers for Skylar Hales, Mason Molina, and some international bonus pool money. I don't hate it. Don't see any reason why they need to keep Phil Maton, so this is a solid addition, even if neither player really are going to be world beaters. And I think they got back a really solid return for Ryan Helsley on an expiring contract. Jesus Baez is a very solid prospect, not top 100, but pretty dang close, and I think Nate Dome has a lot of potential. That's a very solid addition for both of them, and Frank Ellisalt definitely has some potential as well. So I think this is a really good get for Ryan Helsley. Throwing away Eric Fede also doesn't necessarily matter a ton to me. I think they have enough players at their AAA level they can fill in, kind of test some guys out, see how valuable they'll actually be at the major league level. And the Cardinals generally don't sell, but they more retool, and I think this gives them the opportunity to really do that in an interesting way. The Cardinals, I think, had a solid deadline, could have made a couple more big moves. I'm not going to punish them for not trading someone like Nolan Arenado, but there are some more things I think they could have done, and for that reason, I'm going to give them a B+. The Tampa Bay Rays always make subtle moves, and I think they had a couple very subtle moves that could pay off big. They didn't necessarily go all in, but they retooled a little bit, acquiring Adrian Hauser on an expiring contract. I think trading away Curtis Mead is a bit rich. Right now, that dealt from a place of strength because he is an infielder, and they have a ton of really good infield prospects both at AAA and in the major league level, and he was kind of pressed for playing time. I think it was fine to trade him, but I think for half a year of Hauser, I think that's a little rich, especially given that they also traded away Duncan DeWitt and Ben Peebles. I like Taj Bradley more than Griffin Jax as well, so I think it's a toss-up. I think having a strong bullpen arm like that will be very interesting for the Rays, who are good with player development. Maybe they can unlock a little bit more out of Jax, who's already been very well at the major league level, and see exactly how that goes. And maybe if they do end up trading players away like the Rays always do, add and subtract at the same time, Jax can even get an even bigger return in a couple years. Trading away Jose Caballero was a little bit of a surprise, but at the same time, I've already talked about how they have a glutton of infielders, so I wouldn't be shocked to see top prospects like Carson Williams end up getting the call-up because of that. And Everson Pereira is fine as an outfielder. I don't think there's any reason why Rays fans should be concerned that they acquired him or worried that he's going to be worse than Jose Caballero. He's a fine addition, but also not a world beater, and that's just kind of how a lot of trades are at the trade deadline. He's already been signed to AAA, so the Rays don't have him in their current plans, but we'll see exactly how that evolves as the season progresses. In their 3-team deal for Zach Littell, I think they actually ended up on the wrong side of the deal. Hunter Fiducia does absolutely nothing for me. I don't think long-term he's an answer anywhere. He's 28 and still somewhat of a prospect, which at that age, you're not really a prospect in my eyes. And Brian Van Bell has some potential, but isn't necessarily someone I think is a world breaker as a reliever when he does make the major leagues. And I do think the Dodgers ended up getting some of the better prospects when they didn't end up getting the best pieces in the deal. Paul Jarvis and Bednar are also fine. I'm a bigger Paul Jarvis fan than most, but at the end of the day, I don't think this trade was a win for the Rays. On the smaller side, Nick Fortes for Matt Etzel, I think was a big win for them, even if Fortes has been kind of forced out in Miami. And Jadder Arenado for Danny Jansen, I also think is a win for both teams, which makes it really easy to say, even though it's another middle infielder which the Rays have a gluttony of, I think this is a solid addition, someone they could potentially ship around in a couple years. But Arenado has the chance to be a very solid player and a very valuable player going forward. The addition of Tristan Gray and Stuart Fairchild don't really move the needle for me in either way. They're just depth pieces that the Rays, I'm sure, will try something out and see if it works. And if it works, it'll be great. The Rays will definitely do a good job of capitalizing on this value. If not, it's a minor trade that isn't going to have a huge impact on the Tampa Bay Rays long term. For that reason, I'm actually going to give the Tampa Bay Rays a grade of a C minus. There's just a lot of things I didn't necessarily like. There's some interesting things, but a lot of things I'm just not super stoked about. The Rangers are currently tied with the Mariners for the third wildcard spot, and although I don't think they're the better team right now, I can't necessarily blame them for going all in because they have been hot, and the Mariners haven't been necessarily cold, but they're 4-6 in their last 10, and I don't blame the Rangers for trying to capitalize. The Phil Maton trade I don't think is going to move any needles, but I don't necessarily blame them for moving Skylar Hales and Mason Molina for them, including some international bonus pool money. I think that's a totally fine trade. Don't know if I would necessarily make it every time, but definitely not a bad deal. But I do think they slightly overpaid for Merrill Kelly. I think Cole Drake and Mitch Bratt are two very good pitching prospects that, frankly, I think actually the Arizona Diamondbacks got more from this deal than they actually did from the Eugenio Suarez deal, which I think was a big surprise. Danny Coulomb was a nice little addition to their bullpen, but not a world breaker. The Rangers have a bunch of mismatched people, a lot of people you're probably not familiar with, doing really well in their bullpen right now. And Coulomb adds another nice arm that can be high leverage. Getting some cash never hurts, and Cody Heuer wasn't really in the Rangers' long-term plans, or short-term plans for that matter, so no issue there. Overall, I think it's a fine deadline, nothing really to write home about, and for that reason, I'm going to give it a solid B. The Toronto Blue Jays, despite being a very dominant team in the American League this year, had a relatively quiet deadline. They acquired Louis Varland and Ty France from the Minnesota Twins earlier, and I think that's a fine addition. It adds some interesting depth to a Toronto lineup that isn't necessarily super deep beyond the first 5 or 6 players, so I think it's a solid addition and creates some interesting dynamics that they can go ahead and make some really fun lineup combinations with some of the players that they currently have. Louis Varland also slots in as a potential late inning relief arm, and I think that's pretty valuable. Even though that they could have used potentially another lefty, I think there is some solid structure here to have a really good bullpen. They're supplemented also by the addition of Seranthony Dominguez from their in-division rival Baltimore Orioles. Although I do really like Jaron Watts-Brown, just like I liked Alan Rodin, I do think this was a good trade. I have seen some non-major outlets call Cal Steven a top 100 prospect, which I don't personally agree with, but there are people who are more knowledgeable out there than me, and I will trust their judgment on that. And getting Shane Bieber, I think, is a very interesting addition to a Blue Jays starting rotation that is decently stacked with Jose Barrios, Kevin Gausman, Max Scherzer, and Chris Bassett. So adding him is definitely a solid addition. He's still recovering from Tommy John surgeries that he had at the beginning of 2024, so I expect him to come back in time for the playoffs, and maybe they try to just limit him to a relief role, which would be a very interesting addition since they have so many starters already that could be solid in the playoffs. I think that could be a really interesting use of Shane Bieber. I also like Will Wagner. I think he's a good story, and acquiring Brandon Valenzuela for it is completely fine. I have no issue with that. But overall, I think the Toronto Blue Jays did trade a little bit more than what they actually got back in return. And given what a lot of other teams, especially teams in their division like the New York Yankees did, I don't necessarily love this deadline for them, but it's definitely not as bad as some of the others. So I'm going to give them a B minus. The last team we'll talk about, last but not least, is the Washington Nationals, who I think did a phenomenal job this deadline. Jean Lenon has had a breakout year, and the fact that they got him for Alex Call, let alone additionally with Eric Swan, is a huge win, I think, for them. The addition of Josh Randall and Alger Sayers isn't necessarily elite, but I think for Kyle Finnegan, that's a fair price. I do wonder if they could have gotten a little bit more, just given how strong the market for relief pitchers have been, but I do think this is a really good addition. Ronnie Cruz has a lot of people talking. Although I'm not the biggest Christian Franklin fan, I do think the Cubs gave up a little bit too much from Michael Soroka's services, especially if they just end up deploying him out of the bullpen. Jake Eder is someone really interesting, and given that Andrew Chafin and Luis Garcia weren't necessarily in the long-term plans of the Nationals, I don't hate that they went and tried to get a high-upside player like him, and I'm a big fan of Clayton Beeter, and I think trading away Ahmed Rosario for him is a very nice, solid addition. They didn't have any true flashy moves outside of the Kyle Finnegan trade, and again, they probably could have gotten a little bit more from him, but I feel like that's very nitpicky, and overall, I really, really like what the Nationals did. I came into this research and thinking that they had a fine deadline, but after looking at it, I actually really like it, and I think they actually had one of the best deadlines, and they are my second A+. You're not going to see a lot of people think that, but my defense is I think they did exactly what they needed to do. They didn't sacrifice any value. They traded away most of the players that were on expiring contracts, and they didn't do it for a discount, but they got solid players back that they think can fit into their current timeline. And I think they have some really nice upside and actually maximize value for the players that they got and players they traded away. The 2025 trade deadline was absolutely wild with so many crazy deals and players being moved. This is going to be a deadline to remember for years and years to come. If you've made it all the way to the end of this super long video, please go and hit that subscribe button. It's the easiest way to support me and get you more content like this. And I'll be covering as many trades as I possibly can as they come in this offseason and next season into the following trade deadlines and get you some really more interesting baseball content on your timeline as well. Thank you again for making it all the way to the end, and I hope to see you in the very next video.